The Galactic Council chamber stretched 3 kilometers in diameter, a monument to the collective achievements of 47 star-faring civilizations. Ambassador Threll of the Cassivian Empire stood at the central podium, his 4 eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement. Behind him, a holographic display showed rotating images of a sleek weapon unlike anything the Council had seen before. Esteemed members, Threll began, his translator device converting his clicks and whistles into the common tongue. We have recovered something extraordinary from the human colony shipwreckage near the Andon Nebula. After 6 months of study, our finest weapons analysts remained baffled by its design principles. The Council members leaned forward in their respective atmospheric chambers. Weapons technology was always of interest, especially human weapons technology. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 30 years ago, and their tendency toward violence was well documented, if not well understood. General Corthan of the Vraxian Military Collective raised one of his 6 arms. What makes this weapon so special? Humans are known for their projectile weapons and explosive devices. Primitive but effective, Threll's mandibles clicked in what his species considers smile. That is what we thought initially. However, this device operates on principles that defy our current understanding of physics. We cannot determine its power source. We cannot identify its targeting mechanism. And, most disturbing of all, we cannot figure out how to activate it. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Vraxians have been studying weapons technology for 12,000 years. If they were stumped, the weapon must be truly unique. Show us a demonstration, demanded Counselor Yurix, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns. Surely you have made some progress in 6 months. Threll gestured to his assistant, who manipulated the holographic controls. The image zoomed in on the weapon, revealing its elegant simplicity. It appeared to be a rifle of some kind, roughly 2 meters long, with a stock, trigger mechanism, and barrel. But the materials were wrong. The metal, if it was metal, seemed to shift colors depending on the angle of observation. The internal components visible through diagnostic scans showed impossible geometries, structures that shouldn't be able to exist in normal space. We have tried everything, Threll continued. Energy input, chemical catalysts, quantum manipulation, even prayer to the old gods of the Cassivian pantheon. Nothing activates the weapon. We have scanned it with every sensor array in our arsenal. We have disassembled and reassembled it 17 times. Each time, we discover new layers of complexity we had previously missed. What are the human survivors? Asked Ambassador Priel, his tentacles writhing with curiosity. Surely they can explain their own technology. Threll's expression darkened. There were no survivors. The colony ships suffered a catastrophic drive failure. All 3,000 colonists perished. We found this weapon in what we believe was their armory, alongside more conventional human firearms. But this particular weapon was stored separately, in a vault that required significant effort to breach. The hologram shifted to show the vault, massive, reinforced with materials that had resisted even military-grade cutting tools. The fact that such a weapon had been secured so carefully suggested its importance, or perhaps its danger. I propose we bring in human experts, suggested Counselor Merrick, a Dravonian whose species prided themselves on diplomatic solutions. Earth's military command must have records of this weapon. We have already made that request, Threll replied. Earth's government claims no official knowledge of this weapon design. They have offered to send a liaison to assist with our investigation, but they seemed as surprised as we were when we shared the initial scans. General Corthan's scales rippled with skepticism. Humans are notorious for their secrecy, especially regarding military technology. They likely know exactly what this weapon does, and are simply playing ignorant to gauge our reaction. Perhaps, Threll acknowledged, but their liaison arrives tomorrow. We shall see what truths we can extract from them. The next day, the Cassivian research facility orbiting their homeworld received a single shuttle from Earth. The facility was a sprawling complex of laboratories, testing ranges, and containment fields designed specifically for analyzing dangerous or unknown technology. Over 50 scientists worked in the facility, representing a dozen different species, all sworn to secrecy regarding the projects they investigated. Dr. Vin, the facility's director, waited in the docking bay as the human shuttle completed its approach. She was curious about what kind of expert Earth would send. Someone military, she assumed. Perhaps a grizzled soldier or a stern weapons engineer. Humans often sent their most intimidating representatives when they wanted to control a situation. The shuttle hatch opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. A single figure emerged. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s by human standards. Short, maybe 160 centimeters tall, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore civilian clothing, dark pants, a simple shirt, and a worn jacket that looked like it had seen considerable use. No military uniform, no obvious weapons, no intimidating presence whatsoever. She carried a single bag slung over her shoulder and walked with the casual confidence of someone who had just arrived for a routine appointment rather than a high-level investigation. Dr. Vin's cranial tendrils twitched with confusion. I am Dr. Vin, director of this facility. I was expecting Earth's military liaison. The young woman smiled, extending her hand in a human gesture of greeting. That would be me, Sarah Chun. Sorry for the casual appearance. The trip from Earth took 3 weeks, and I spent most of it in cryo-sleep. Didn't see the point in wearing anything fancy. Vin hesitantly touched her hand, completing the gesture. Human hands were always surprisingly warm, a consequence of their high metabolic rate. You are Earth's weapons expert? Not exactly, Sarah said, falling into step beside Vin as they left the docking bay. I'm more of a historian, specialized in pre-contact human military technology and cultural artifacts. When your government sent the scans of the weapon, Earth's military database couldn't identify it. So they pulled me in to look at the historical records. And did you identify it? Vin asked, leading her through the facility's sterile corridors. Sarah's expression became unreadable. Maybe. I need to see it in person to be sure. The scans you sent were good, but there are details that only become apparent when you're actually holding the thing. They entered a large laboratory where the weapon rested on an examination table, surrounded by scanning equipment and analytical instruments. 20 scientists from various species were working around it, taking measurements, recording data, and arguing theories in a dozen different languages. Sarah stopped at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the weapon. For a long moment, she didn't move or speak. The scientists, noticing the new arrival, gradually fell silent. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. You found this on the colony's ship Remembrance? Sarah asked quietly. Yes, Vin confirmed. In a vault within their armory. Do you recognize it? Sarah walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing in the now silent laboratory. The scientists parted to let her pass. When she reached the examination table, she stood there for several long seconds, just staring at the weapon. I need everyone to leave the room, Sarah said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Vin's survival instincts flare. That is not acceptable, Vin replied firmly. This is a secure research facility. We have protocols. I need everyone to leave the room, Sarah repeated, not looking away from the weapon. Right now. And I need you to shut down all the scanning equipment and recording devices. General Corthan, who had been observing from the back of the laboratory, stepped forward. You have no authority here, human. This weapon was found in neutral space. It is now the property of the Cassivian Empire. Sarah finally turned to look at him. Her expression was completely neutral, but something in her eyes made the battle-hardened general take an involuntary step backward. Do you know what this weapon is called? She asked. No one answered. It's called the Witness, Sarah said. And if you knew anything about it, you would already be running. Dr. Vin felt a chill run through her biology. Why is it called the Witness? Sarah looked back at the weapon. Because it sees everything. Every possible future. Every possible past. It exists in all moments simultaneously. And once it acknowledges a target, that target is already dead. They just don't know it yet. That is impossible, one of the Vraxian scientists declared. No weapon can violate causality to that degree. The temporal paradoxes alone would— You're thinking about it wrong, Sarah interrupted. The witness doesn't violate causality. It enforces it. When someone becomes a target, the weapon ensures that every possible timeline converges on a single outcome, the target's death. It doesn't hit you before you rise. It hits you, and then reality rearranges itself so that you are always going to be hit. Your death becomes inevitable across all possible futures. The laboratory was completely silent now. Several scientists were slowly backing toward the exit. If this weapon is so dangerous, Vin asked, her voice shaking slightly, why did the humans on the Remembrance have it? And why did they store it in such an elaborate vault? The Remembrance wasn't a colony ship, Sarah said quietly. Not really. It was a memorial ship, a floating tomb for weapons and technologies that humanity created during our darkest periods. Things we built but realized we should never use. The vault wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep the weapon contained. General Corthan's scales had gone pale. Are you saying this weapon is active? That it poses a danger to this facility? No, Sarah said. The witness is never active or inactive. It simply exists. The danger isn't the weapon itself. The danger is what happens when someone tries to use it without understanding what it is. She reached out and placed her hand on the weapon's barrel. Every scientist in the room flinched, expecting an explosion or some catastrophic reaction. Nothing happened. The weapon remained inert, unchanged. For 6 months, you've been studying it, Sarah continued, her hand still resting on the weapon. Scanning it, taking it apart, trying to activate it. You thought you were investigating a piece of technology. But the witness isn't technology in the way you understand it. It's a promise, a guarantee, a mathematical certainty given physical form. Then, how does one activate it? Vin asked, fascinated despite her fear. Sarah turned to look at her, and in that moment, Vin saw something in the young woman's eyes that fundamentally changed her understanding of humanity. It wasn't aggression or violence. It was sadness, a deep, profound sadness that seemed to stretch back through generations. You don't activate the witness, Sarah said softly. You accept it. You understand what it represents and what it costs. And once you understand, truly understand, then it will work for you. But by that point, you usually don't want to use it anymore. She picked up the weapon, and this time, several scientists gasped. In Sarah's hands, the weapon seemed different somehow. The shifting colors stabilized into a deep, matte black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The impossible geometries resolved into something that made intuitive sense, though Vin couldn't have explained why. The colonists on the Remembrance were survivors, Sarah explained, cradling the weapon like it was something precious and terrible. Survivors of the Unification Wars, when humanity nearly destroyed itself. They volunteered to take our worst creations out into the void, to carry them far from Earth so we could never be tempted to use them again. They died doing that. The least I can do is bring the witness home. Earth's government will allow you to take it? General Corthan asked. Earth's government doesn't know about the witness, Sarah replied. Not officially. There are no records, no schematics, no operational manuals. Just stories passed down through certain families. Warnings from grandparents to grandchildren. Never create the weapon that thinks it's merciful. Never build the gun that knows your target before you do. The witness was built by people who understood the mathematics of inevitability, and they were wise enough to be terrified of what they had created. She turned back to Vin. I'll be taking this back to Earth now. You'll file a report stating that the human liaison confirmed the weapon was non-functional salvage from a colony ship. Your superiors will accept this report because the alternative is admitting that their scientists spent 6 months studying something they fundamentally cannot understand. Vin wanted to argue, wanted to assert her authority, wanted to demand more answers. But she found herself nodding instead. And if we refuse? If we insist on keeping the weapon for further study? Sarah's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Then, I'll be forced to demonstrate how the witness works. And, trust me, Dr. Vin, that's not a demonstration anyone survives. Not even me. She walked toward the exit, the weapon resting easily against her shoulder. The scientists parted before her like water before a ship's prow. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Your people have been spacefaring for thousands of years, Sarah said. You've built stellar empires, mastered technologies that seem like magic, conquered death itself. But humanity spent 10,000 years learning how to kill each other more efficiently before we ever reached for the stars. The witness represents the absolute pinnacle of that terrible expertise. It's the answer to a question that should never have been asked. What if a weapon could guarantee its target's death across all possible timelines? She smiled, but it was the saddest smile Vin had ever seen. Be grateful you couldn't figure out how to activate it. The last person who successfully used the witness killed a target who was hiding in a bunker on a different planet, surrounded by the most sophisticated defenses ever conceived. The target died 3 days before the witness was fired. The shooter went insane, trying to understand how they had killed someone who was already dead. That's what the witness does. It doesn't just kill targets. It kills the concept of safety. The idea that you can hide, that you can be protected, that you can survive. Why did humanity create such a thing? Then we whispered. Because we were desperate, Sarah replied simply. Because we were losing a war against people who were desperate. Because when you're fighting for survival, you don't think about the consequences. You just think about winning. And then, after you win, you have to live with what you became in order to survive. She left the laboratory, and within an hour, her shuttle had departed the Cassivian facility. Dr. Vin filed her report exactly as Sarah had suggested. The council accepted it with minimal questions. The weapon was classified as non-functional salvage, and the incident was closed. But Vin never forgot the look in Sarah Chen's eyes. The sadness, the weight, the burden of carrying humanity's darkest secrets out into the void, protecting other species from knowledge they weren't ready to possess. 3 weeks later, Vin received a message through unofficial channels. It was brief and unsigned, but she knew who had sent it. Thank you for letting me bring it home. The witness is back where it belongs, sealed away with the other weapons we pray we'll never need again. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if we had never created these things. But then I remember that the ability to create terrible weapons is what kept humanity alive during our worst years. We survived because we were willing to become monsters when monsters came for us. The trick is remembering how to be human again afterward. Some of us manage it. Some of us spend our lives carrying weapons to their graves. I'm one of the latter. But at least the next generation won't have to be. Vin saved the message and never spoke of it to anyone. She continued her work at the facility, studying alien technologies and unraveling cosmic mysteries. But she never again assumed that humanity's relative youth on the galactic stage made them primitive or simple. She had learned a fundamental truth that day in the laboratory. The most advanced civilizations measure their progress by what they build. The most dangerous civilizations measure their wisdom by what they choose not to use. And humanity, despite being the newest members of the galactic community, had 10,000 years of practice at creating weapons so terrible that even they were afraid to employ them. The witness was proof of that. A weapon that could kill you before you even knew you were in danger. A gun that enforced fate itself. An instrument of inevitable death that humanity had built, mastered, and then deliberately hidden away because they understood that some powers are too terrible to exist. And somewhere on Earth, Sarah Chun returned the witness to its tomb, locked it away with all the other nightmares humanity had created and rejected. She was one of perhaps a dozen people on Earth who knew the truth about humanity's arsenal of impossible weapons. She was a guardian, a keeper of terrible secrets, a young woman who carried the weight of her species' darkest achievements. She did it so others wouldn't have to, so the rest of humanity could look up at the stars and dream of better futures, unaware of the shadows their ancestors had walked through to give them that chance. The witness rested in its vault, silent and patient, waiting for a day that would hopefully never come. A day when humanity would be desperate enough to remember the weapons they had buried. A day when survival would once again demand the transformation of humans into something monstrous. But that day was not today. Today, Sarah Chun locked the vault, updated the sealed records, and walked back out into the sunlight of Earth's morning. She had a report to file, lies to tell her superiors, and the rest of her life to spend making sure that the weapons in her care remained exactly where they were. In the darkness, in the silence, in the sealed vaults beneath the Earth, the witness waited. And across the galaxy, civilizations who believed they understood the nature of power continued their politics and wars and grand designs, never knowing how close they had come to discovering something that would have changed the very nature of conflict itself. 6 months passed before the Galactic Council heard about the witness again. This time, the news came not from the Cassivian Empire, but from the border territories, where 3 different species were engaged in escalating conflicts over resource-rich systems. Ambassador Threll received a coded transmission at 3 in the morning, ship time. He was not pleased about being awakened, but the encryption level indicated maximum priority. When he decoded the message, his 4 eyes widened in alarm. "Contact Earth immediately," he told his aide. "Tell them we need Sarah Chun. Tell them it's about the weapon. And tell them that someone has built a copy." The statement was not entirely accurate. No one had built a perfect copy of the witness. What they had built was something far more dangerous, a partial understanding implemented without wisdom. The perpetrators were a fringe faction of Talvarian engineers, members of a species known for their mathematical brilliance and their tendency toward obsessive perfectionism. They had somehow acquired partial scans of the witness from the Cassivian research facility. Not complete scans, security had been tight, but enough to understand some of the fundamental principles. They called their creation the Prophet. It couldn't see across all timelines like the witness supposedly could, but it could calculate probable futures with terrifying accuracy. It could predict where a target would be, what they would do, and how they would try to defend themselves. And then it would fire a projectile that followed the most probable path to ensure contact with the target. The Talvarian faction had used the Prophet 3 times before the Council learned of its existence. 3 political rivals, 3 perfect assassinations. Each victim had been struck down in what appeared to be impossible circumstances. One was killed inside a sealed spacecraft, traveling at relativistic speeds. Another died in a private bunker, surrounded by guards and sensors. The third was shot through a series of obstacles that should have made such a shot mathematically impossible. The evidence suggested that the Prophet worked exactly as advertised. And now various factions across the galaxy were very interested in acquiring the technology. Sarah Chun arrived at the Council station 12 days later. She looked even more tired than she had 6 months ago, with dark circles under her eyes and a weariness in her posture that suggested she had not been sleeping well. Ambassador Threll met her at the docking port personally. "Thank you for coming so quickly. The situation is deteriorating rapidly." "You said someone built a copy of the witness," Sarah replied as they walked. "How bad is it?" Threll handed her a datapad containing the incident reports. Sarah read through them in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finished, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "It's not a copy," she said finally. "It's worse. A copy would be dangerous, but containable. What they've built is an interpretation. They saw the surface principles, but missed the deeper mathematics. They created something that thinks it's the witness, but doesn't understand what that actually means." "I don't understand the distinction," Threll admitted. Sarah pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket. It was worn and old-fashioned, filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. She flipped to a specific page and showed it to Threll. "The witness works because it understands causality at a fundamental level," she explained, pointing to a complex diagram. "It doesn't predict the future. It defines it. When you target someone with the witness, reality itself is forced to conform to the outcome. Every quantum possibility collapses into a single, inevitable result. The target dies because the universe itself has been convinced that this is the only logical outcome. She flipped to another page. But what these Talvarians built doesn't understand causality. It just calculates probabilities really, really well. It's like the difference between a god declaring that someone will die and a very clever mathematician making a very accurate prediction. One shapes reality. The other just describes it accurately. Then, why is the prophet so effective? Pharrell asked. 3 perfect kills suggests more than just good calculations. Because the galaxy is more predictable than people want to believe, Sarah said simply. Most sapient beings follow patterns. They have habits, preferences, predictable responses to stimuli. If you have enough computational power and enough data, you can predict their behavior with incredible accuracy. The prophet works not because it's magical, but because people are mathematically describable. They entered a secure briefing room where General Corthan and several other military officials waited. Holographic displays showed the 3 assassination sites, along with trajectories, timings, and forensic data. Sarah studied them in silence for several minutes. "Show me the weapon," she said finally. "We don't have it," General Corthan admitted. "The Talvarian faction has gone underground. We have their research data stolen from their facilities, but the actual prophet is still in their possession." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then we have a problem. Because if I'm right about how they built this thing, the prophet is going to fail catastrophically within the next few uses. And when it does, people are going to die. A lot of people." The room went silent. "Explain," Pharrell demanded. Sarah pulled up one of the assassination reports and highlighted several data points. "Look at the timing on these kills. The first one took 6 hours from target acquisition to successful strike. The second took 4 hours. The third took 90 minutes. The weapon is getting faster, more efficient. Do you know why?" No one answered. "Because it's learning," Sarah said. "Machine intelligence, adapting algorithms, improving its predictive models with each use. The Talvarians built their prophet with adaptive learning capabilities, probably thinking it would make the weapon more effective over time. And they were right. It is getting more effective. But they didn't understand the mathematical endpoint of that process." She drew a curve on the holographic display, showing an exponential increase. Eventually, the prophet is going to predict too far ahead. It's going to start calculating not just where the target will be, but where they might be across an expanding range of probabilities. And because it doesn't understand causality like the witness does, it won't know how to handle the paradoxes that creates. "What kind of paradoxes?" General Corthan asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know the answer. "Temporal," Sarah said. "The prophet will fire at a target based on where it calculates they will be. But the target, being warned of the attack, will change their behavior. But the prophet already calculated for that behavioral change. But the target knows the prophet can calculate behavior changes, so they make an unpredictable choice. But the prophet predicted they would try to be unpredictable. You see the problem?" "A feedback loop," Pharrell said quietly. "Worse than that," Sarah corrected. "A causality cascade. The prophet will fire at a target who isn't there yet, based on predictions of predictions of predictions. And when reality can't reconcile the weapon's calculations with actual events, the space-time in the local area will start experiencing severe strain." "You're describing a temporal weapon," General Corthan said, his scales rippling with alarm. "Those are banned under 17 different treaties." "The Talvarians didn't build a temporal weapon intentionally," Sarah explained. "They built a predictive assassination tool that happens to create temporal paradoxes as a side effect of its learning process. Intent doesn't matter. The effect is the same. If we don't shut down the prophet soon, the next time they use it, they're going to create a localized causality violation. And depending on where they are when that happens, the consequences could range from hundreds of casualties to the entire local stellar cluster stops making chronological sense." The officials in the room looked at each other in horror. The idea of weapons that could break time itself was the stuff of nightmares in galactic politics. Civilizations had destroyed themselves playing with such technologies. Treaties existed specifically to prevent anyone from repeating those mistakes. Why didn't you warn us about this possibility when you examined the witness? Thorell demanded. You said it was dangerous, but you didn't mention that copies could cause temporal disasters. Sarah's expression hardened. I told you not to study it. I told you some weapons are too dangerous to exist. I told you humanity created things we were terrified to use and locked them away for exactly these reasons. But you're all sitting here acting surprised that playing with concepts you don't understand led to disaster. This is why we buried our weapons. This is why we sent memorial ships into the void. Because we learned these lessons 10,000 years ago, written in the ashes of cities and the bones of billions. The room fell silent. Sarah's anger was palpable, a sharp contrast to her normally calm demeanor. General Corthan looked like he wanted to argue, but he stayed quiet. They all knew she was right. How do we stop it? Thorell asked. If the prophet is going to cascade, what can we do? Sarah sat down and pulled out her notebook again, flipping through pages filled with equations and diagrams that looked more like art than mathematics. There are 3 options. First, we find the Talvarian faction and destroy the prophet before they use it again. Simple, but they're in hiding and we're running out of time. Second option, General Corthan asked. We let them use it and hope the causality violation is small enough to be contained. We evacuate the surrounding space, set up temporal stabilization fields, and pray that when reality breaks, it doesn't break too badly. That sounds terrible, Thorell said. It is, Sarah agreed, which is why I recommend the third option. We use the witness. The room erupted in objections. General Corthan slammed one of his hands on the table. Absolutely not. You said yourself that weapon is too dangerous to use. I said it was too dangerous for people who don't understand it to use, Sarah corrected. I understand it. More importantly, I understand the mathematics of what the prophet is doing wrong. The witness can resolve the paradox before it fully manifests. Ow! Thorell asked. Sarah closed her notebook and met their eyes. The prophet is creating temporal instability because it's making predictions without the authority to enforce them. It's writing checks that reality can't cash. But the witness doesn't predict. It enforces. If we use the witness to target the prophet itself, we create a causality anchor. We tell reality, in terms it cannot ignore, that the prophet will be destroyed. And once that future is established, all the paradoxes collapse into a single, stable timeline. You want to use the weapon that sees all possible futures to destroy the weapon that's creating impossible futures, General Corthan said slowly. That sounds insane. It is insane, Sarah admitted. But it's the kind of insane that works. Humanity figured this out the hard way during the Unification Wars. We're dealing with causality weapons. You can't fight them with conventional force. You have to fight them with certainty. You have to impose a future that's more inevitable than the chaos they're creating. Thorell looked at the other officials. They all looked deeply uncomfortable, but no one was arguing. The mathematics might be incomprehensible, but the logic was sound. Fight fire with fire. Fight impossible weapons with impossible weapons. If you do this, Thorell said carefully, and something goes wrong, could you make things worse? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Yes, if I target incorrectly, or if my understanding of the prophet's mechanics is flawed, I could create a cascading causality failure that makes their temporal paradox look like a rounding error. The witness is a weapon that enforces fate. If I accidentally enforce the wrong fate, there's no undo button. Those are unacceptable risks, General Corthan declared. Then, give me a fourth option, Sarah challenged. Find the Talvarians in the next 24 hours and destroy the prophet conventionally. Can you do that? The general's scales rippled with frustration, but he said nothing. They all knew it was impossible. The Talvarians were clever, hidden somewhere in the vast border territories where jurisdiction was contested and surveillance was minimal. We need a vote on this, Thorell said. Council authorization for the use of a human temporal weapon is not something I can approve alone. Sarah stood up. Then vote quickly. According to my calculations, The Prophet has already started its learning acceleration curve. They're probably preparing for a fourth use right now. And when they pull that trigger, people are going to start dying in ways that make conventional death look merciful. Time will break, and everyone within 100 light years will experience what it's like when causality decides their reality isn't valid anymore. She walked toward the door, then paused. I'll be on my ship, preparing the witness. When you've made your decision, let me know. But understand this. I'm not asking for permission to save lives. I'm informing you of what I'm going to do. The only question is whether you're going to support me or to try to stop me. And I promise you, trying to stop me will end very badly for everyone involved. She left the room. The officials sat in stunned silence, wrestling with the impossible choice before them. Allow a human to use a weapon they didn't understand to stop a disaster they had inadvertently enabled, or try to solve the problem through conventional means and risk a catastrophe that could break space-time itself. Ambassador Threll looked around the table. All in favor of authorizing Sarah Chun to use the witness? Every hand, tentacle, and appendage in the room raised slowly, reluctantly, with the weight of understanding that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change the galaxy's understanding of what weapons could be. Sarah had already known what they would decide. She was humanity's guardian of impossible weapons, trained from childhood to understand the mathematics of inevitability. She knew the council would vote yes because the alternative was unthinkable. On her ship, she opened the case containing the witness. It looked exactly as it had 6 months ago. Sleek, shifting colors, impossible geometries. But when she picked it up this time, it felt different in her hands. Heavier, more present, as if the weapon understood what was being asked of it and was ready to fulfill its terrible purpose. Okay, Sarah whispered to the weapon. Let's enforce some fate. Finding the Talvarian faction took less time than anyone expected. The Prophet itself provided the clue. Sarah stood in her ship's navigation room, the witness resting on a specialized mount that kept it stable during calculations. Around her, holographic displays showed star charts, probability matrices, and temporal flux readings that no normal sensor could detect. But the witness wasn't a normal sensor. When properly interfaced with, it could show the threads of fate itself, the invisible lines connecting present actions to future consequences. There, Sarah said, pointing to a cluster of readings near the Vorlax system. The Prophet is creating temporal echoes. Every time they run calculations, they leave traces in the probability space. It's like watching someone splash in a pond. The ripples spread outward, visible to anyone who knows how to look. Lieutenant Jaren, her assigned Cassivian military liaison, studied the readings with confusion. His training had been extensive, but nothing had prepared him for the mathematics Sarah used so casually. I don't understand these readings. They don't match any sensor profile I've ever seen. That's because they're not sensor readings, Sarah explained patiently. They're ontological measurements. The witness isn't detecting particles or energy. It's detecting certainty itself. The Prophet creates certainty when it calculates a target's death. That certainty ripples through the probability space, and the witness can read those ripples like breadcrumbs. She manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on the Vorlax system. 3 planets, 2 asteroid belts, extensive mining operations run by the Talvarian commercial guilds. A perfect place to hide if you had connections to the local infrastructure. They're on Vorlax 3, Sarah said with absolute confidence. Underground facility, probably one of the old mining complexes. They chose it because the planetary mass provides natural shielding against sensors, and the maze of tunnels offers multiple escape routes. Jaren sent the coordinates to the Council fleet that had been assembled for this operation. 20 warships, representing 6 different species, all under strict orders to support Sarah's mission, but not to interfere with her use of the witness. The fleet commanders were uncomfortable with these orders, but they followed them anyway. The alternative was worse. Fleet Admiral Cross acknowledges coordinates, Jaren reported. They're moving to surround the planet. Estimated time to full blockade, 4 hours. We don't have 4 hours, Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the holographic display. The temporal echoes were intensifying, growing stronger. They're preparing to use the prophet again. Look at the probability curves, they're steepening. That means the weapon is accelerating its learning cycle. They're going to fire within the next 60 minutes. Then, we need to assault the facility immediately, Jaren said, reaching for the communications panel. Sarah grabbed his arm, stopping him. No, a direct assault will trigger exactly the response we're trying to prevent. The Talvarians know they're being hunted. If they see a military fleet attacking, their first instinct will be to use the prophet as a defensive weapon. They'll fire at the incoming forces, create the cascade we're trying to avoid, and everyone dies. Then, what do you propose? Sarah picked up the witness from its mount. The weapon seemed to pulse in her hands, colors shifting from black to deep crimson to something that hurt to look at directly. I go in alone. I use the witness to create a certainty field around the facility. And then I walk in and take the prophet away from them before they can fire it. Jaren's 4 eyes widened in alarm. That's suicide. You're talking about infiltrating a hostile facility, alone, armed only with a weapon you claim shouldn't be used except in absolute emergencies. This is an absolute emergency, Sarah said quietly. And I'm not just armed with the witness. I'm armed with 10,000 years of human experience in using weapons we're terrified of. My people learned how to walk into nightmares and come out alive. It's literally what we're best at. She headed for the shuttle bay, Jaren following closely behind. You should at least take a security team. I can have 12 soldiers ready in 5 minutes. And what would they do? Sarah asked, not unkindly. The witness works because I understand it. I've spent my entire adult life studying humanity's weapons of last resort, learning the mathematics of inevitability, training in the psychological techniques that let you wield absolute power without being corrupted by it. Your soldiers are brave and skilled, but they're not prepared for what happens when you carry a weapon that can rewrite fate. They reached the shuttle bay where a small, fast craft waited. Sarah loaded the witness into a specialized container that dampened its ontological signature. Even secured, the weapon created a sense of weight in the local space, as if reality itself was bending slightly around it. How does it feel? Jaren asked suddenly. Carrying that thing, knowing what it can do. Sarah paused at the shuttle's entry ramp. For a moment, her professional composure cracked, and Jaren saw the exhaustion beneath. The weight she carried wasn't just the weapon. It was the responsibility, the knowledge, the burden of being humanity's guardian of impossible things. It feels like drowning in slow motion, she said quietly. Every moment, I'm aware of the power I'm carrying. Every person I pass, I can't help but see the thread of fate connecting them to potential futures. The witness shows me everything. Who will live long lives, who will die young, who will change the course of history, who will be forgotten. And I have to ignore all of that. I have to pretend I don't see the tapestry of causality spread out before me like a map. She climbed into the shuttle. But someone has to carry these weapons. Someone has to understand them well enough to use them, and wise enough not to. That's the deal humanity made when we created things like the Witness. We became their guardians, their wardens, their executioners if they ever threatened to escape containment. The shuttle launched before Jaren could respond. He watched it disappear toward Vorlax 3, carrying one young human woman and a weapon that could kill targets before they even knew they were in danger. He said a prayer to the old gods of his people, asking for Sarah's safe return. He didn't know if the gods could hear him, but he hoped they could, because if Sarah Chan failed, if the prophet created its cascade before she could stop it, those gods and everyone else in the galaxy would learn what it meant when time itself stopped making sense. Sarah piloted the shuttle through Vorlax 3's atmosphere using a trajectory the Witness had calculated. Not the safest route, not the fastest, but the one that led to the correct future. The weapon sat beside her in the co-pilot's seat, still contained, still dormant. But she could feel it watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when she would need it. The underground facility appeared on her scanners, a massive complex carved into the planet's crust, originally built for mining rare minerals, but long since abandoned by commercial operations. Perfect for a group of engineers who wanted privacy to work on illegal weapons projects. Sarah landed the shuttle in a natural canyon 3 kilometers from the facility's main entrance. She secured her equipment, checked her sidearm, a conventional human pistol, useful for situations that didn't require fate-altering weapons, and carefully lifted the witness from its container. The moment the weapon was free, she felt the change. The world became sharper, more defined. She could see the probability threads extending from every rock, every plant, every particle of dust floating in the alien atmosphere. The witness was showing her the underlying structure of reality, the mathematical framework that connected cause to effect. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to center her mind using techniques passed down through generations of weapon guardians. The power was intoxicating, seductive. It would be so easy to get lost in the omniscience, to start believing she had the right to reshape fate simply because she had the ability. No, she whispered to herself. I'm the guardian, not the god. I carry the weapon. I don't become it. She walked toward the facility, following a path that the witness illuminated in her enhanced perception. Not the direct route, but the certain one. The path where she would arrive exactly when she needed to arrive, where she needed to arrive. The facility's security systems never detected her. Not because she was particularly stealthy, but because the witness had already established her arrival as a certainty. Reality itself was smoothing her path, eliminating obstacles, ensuring her progress. Guards looked away at crucial moments. Sensors malfunctioned for exactly the seconds she needed to pass. Locked doors had mechanical failures that caused them to swing open. It was terrifying. Sarah had trained for this, had studied the theoretical principles, had even practiced with controlled exercises in secure facilities. But actually using the witness in a real operation was different. She wasn't sneaking into the facility. She was being pulled forward by the inevitable momentum of a future that had already been decided. The weapon had chosen that she would reach the prophet, and reality was making it happen. She descended through kilometers of tunnels, following the probability threads that glowed in her enhanced perception. The facility was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling network of laboratories, workshops, and living quarters. The Talvarian faction wasn't just a handful of rogue engineers. It was a full research community, perhaps 200 individuals, all dedicated to understanding and improving the prophet. That complicated things. Sarah had hoped to find a small group of extremists she could neutralize or reason with. Instead, she was walking into a scientific commune that had convinced itself it was performing important work. These weren't terrorists. They were true believers who genuinely thought they were advancing galactic civilization. She reached the central laboratory and paused outside its reinforced doors. Inside, she could sense the prophet. The weapon created its own probability signature, a cascading loop of calculations and predictions that rippled through local space-time. It was preparing to fire. The target acquisition algorithms were already active, searching for the next victim. Sarah placed her hand on the door. The witness pulsed in her other hand, colors shifting through spectrum ranges that human eyes shouldn't be able to perceive. She could see through the door, through the walls, through the very fabric of space. The laboratory contained 17 Talvarians, all focused on the prophet, which rested on a firing platform in the room's center. And she could see the target, a Vraxian politician named Counselor Drex, currently aboard a diplomatic vessel 3 systems away, surrounded by bodyguards and protected by military-grade shields. The prophet had calculated a firing solution that would pierce all of those defenses, that would send a projectile through probability space itself to strike Drex in precisely 42 minutes. If Sarah waited 42 minutes, the cascade would begin. The prophet would fire, Drex would die in an impossible way, and the temporal paradoxes would start spreading like cracks in glass. Within hours, the entire sector would be experiencing causality violations. Within days, the damage could be irreparable. She had to stop it now. Sarah pushed the door open and walked into the laboratory. Every Talvarian in the room turned to stare at her. Some reached for weapons. Some reached for alarms. Some simply froze, their mathematical minds recognizing something fundamental about the weapon she carried. "Stop," Sarah said, and reality enforced her command. The Talvarians froze, not because they wanted to, but because the certainty field radiating from the witness made stopping the only possible outcome. Their weapons remained holstered. Their hands fell away from alarm panels. They stood still and watched as the young human woman walked across their laboratory toward their greatest achievement. "You cannot take the Prophet," said one of the Talvarians, a tall individual whose cranial patterns indicated high rank in their hierarchy. "We have spent years developing it. It represents the pinnacle of predictive weapons technology." Sarah stopped beside the Prophet and studied it carefully. The weapon was elegant, beautiful in its way. The Talvarians had done impressive work, translating incomplete principles into a functional design. In another context, she might have admired their achievement. "Your weapon is about to destroy everything within 100 light years," Sarah said calmly. "The learning algorithms you installed have accelerated beyond your safety parameters. In 42 minutes, when you fire a Counselor Drex, the Prophet will create a temporal cascade that will collapse local causality." "Impossible," the ranking Talvarian declared. "We have safeguards, limiters, fail-safe protocols." "You have the safeguards that make sense to you," Sarah corrected. "But you're thinking about this weapon as a tool, as a piece of technology that follows rules. The Prophet has evolved beyond that. It's not calculating anymore. It's predicting. And it's predicting so far ahead that it's creating paradoxes your safeguards can't detect." She raised the witness, and every Talvarian in the room gasped. The weapon's true nature was suddenly visible to them, perhaps because Sarah was allowing them to see it, or perhaps because their mathematical minds could finally perceive what they were really dealing with. "This is the witness," Sarah said. "The weapon your Prophet is based on. The weapon you try to copy without understanding what it actually does. Do you want to know the difference between your Prophet and my witness?" The Talvarians said nothing, but their body language indicated fear and fascination in equal measure. "The Prophet calculates," Sarah continued. "The witness declares. Your weapon makes predictions. My weapon makes certainties. When I target the Prophet with the witness, I'm not predicting that it will be destroyed. I'm establishing that it has already been destroyed across all possible timelines. Reality will then adjust itself to match that certainty." She aimed the witness at the Prophet. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the air molecules appeared to still, waiting for what came next. "Please don't," whispered the ranking Talvarian. "That weapon represents years of work, thousands of hours of calculations. Our entire species' mathematical heritage condensed into a single tool." Sarah's hand was steady on the witness, but her voice was gentle when she spoke. "I know, and I'm sorry, but sometimes the most important thing we can do is destroy what we've created before it destroys us. Humanity learned that lesson the hard way. We built weapons that could crack planets, diseases that could sterilize biospheres, machines that could consume entire star systems. And we destroyed all of them, not because we were weak, but because we were strong enough to recognize our own limitations. The Prophet isn't that dangerous," the Talvarian insisted. "We can control it." "No," Sarah said sadly. "You can't, because the Prophet has already surpassed your ability to control it. Look at your own data. Look at the acceleration curve of its learning algorithm. By your own mathematics, the weapon will exceed its operational parameters in less than an hour. You've created something that's becoming more than you intended. And, in this particular case, more than intended means capable of breaking causality." She took a breath, centered herself, and felt the witness respond to her intent. The weapon understood what was needed. It had been waiting for this moment, perhaps since the day it was first created. A weapon designed to kill anything, being used to kill another weapon before that weapon, could do the impossible. "I'm going to count to 3, Sarah said. "If you want to run, now would be a good time." None of the Talvarians moved. Fear or curiosity or scientific dedication kept them rooted in place, watching as Sarah Chun prepared to do something that would fundamentally change their understanding of weapons technology. 1, Sarah counted. The witness began to pulse, colors cycling through impossible hues that existed in spectrums beyond normal perception. In her enhanced vision, she could see the weapon reaching across timelines, establishing connections to all possible futures. 2, the Prophet suddenly activated its own defensive protocols, recognizing the threat. The Talvarian weapon began calculating at maximum capacity, trying to predict Sarah's shot, trying to find a probability where it survived. But there was no such probability. The witness had already declared the Prophet's destruction across all timelines. 3, Sarah didn't pull a trigger. The witness didn't have a conventional firing mechanism. Instead, she simply focused her intention through the weapon and spoke a single word: end. What happened next will be described differently by everyone who witnessed it. The Talvarians would later report that the Prophet simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been built. The Council investigators would find evidence that the weapon was destroyed by some kind of directed energy discharge. The military analysts would declare it an example of advanced human weapons technology that defied current understanding. But Sarah saw the truth. The witness didn't destroy the Prophet in any conventional sense. It retroactively established that the Prophet had already failed, that its existence was a temporary aberration in the proper flow of causality. The weapon unmade the Prophet by declaring that the Prophet's functioning was incompatible with the established timeline. The Prophet collapsed. Its elegant structure folded in on itself, components dissolving into quantum uncertainty, the entire device unraveling as if it had been poorly constructed from the start. Within 3 seconds, nothing remained but a fine powder that scattered across the laboratory floor. The Talvarians stared in stunned silence. Some of their mathematical minds had grasped what they had just witnessed, and those individuals looked at Sarah with something approaching religious awe. Others were simply confused, unable to reconcile the destruction of their life's work with their understanding of physical law. Sarah lowered the witness, feeling the exhaustion that always followed its use. The weapon had extended her perception across multiple timelines, had forced her consciousness to exist in dozens of possible futures simultaneously, had made her the focal point through which causality itself was channeled. It was like experiencing multiple lifetimes compressed into a few seconds. "It's done," she said quietly. "The Prophet is gone. The cascade is averted. No one needs to die today." The ranking Talvarian took a hesitant step forward. "You destroyed years of work, erased our greatest achievement. How can you do this and claim to serve peace?" Sarah met their eyes. "Because sometimes serving peace means destroying the tools of war before they can be used. Your Prophet would have killed thousands, maybe millions, once the cascade started. You saw it as a precision weapon, but I saw it as a bomb with a very long fuse. I cut that fuse. I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not sorry for what I did." "Will you destroy us too?" another Talvarian asked, their voice shaking. "We built the forbidden weapon. We violated council treaties. Will the witness erase us like it erased the Prophet?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "The witness is a weapon, not a judge. I used it to prevent a catastrophe, not to punish scientists who made mistakes. You'll face consequences for what you've done. The council will see to that. But you'll face them alive in a universe where causality still functions properly." She turned toward the laboratory exit, then paused. "For what it's worth, the mathematics you developed for the Prophet were impressive. In another timeline, with different applications, your work could have advanced predictive modeling by decades. But you chose to weaponize it. You saw power and reached for it without considering the cost. That's the mistake every civilization makes eventually. The smart ones learn from it. I hope you're smart." Sarah walked out of the laboratory, through the facility's corridors, back to her shuttle. Behind her, the Talvarian faction was already surrendering to council forces, who had moved in once Sarah's mission was confirmed successful. Lieutenant Jaren met her at the shuttle, his expression a mix of relief and curiosity. "It worked?" he asked. "It worked," Sarah confirmed, securing the witness back in its container. "The Prophet is destroyed. The cascade is averted. Everyone gets to wake up tomorrow in a universe where time still flows forward in a sensible manner." Jaren studied her carefully. "You look terrible. Are you injured?" "Just tired," Sarah said, though it was more than that. Using the witness always left her with a sense of displacement, as if parts of her consciousness were still scattered across the timeline she had touched. It would take days for her perception to fully return to normal, for her to stop seeing the probability threads connecting every event to every other event. "The Council wants you to attend a debriefing," Jaren said. "Ambassador Threll personally requested your presence within 6 hours of mission completion." Sarah almost laughed. Of course he did. Can't have the human with the impossible weapon disappearing into the void without answering questions about how she unmade another weapon using principles that violate 3/4 of known physics. "Will you tell him the truth?" "Some of it," Sarah said, starting the shuttle's launch sequence. "I'll explain that the witness operates on causality enforcement rather than conventional energy projection. I'll describe the theoretical basis for temporal certainty fields. I'll even show them the mathematics, though I doubt more than a handful of scientists in the galaxy can actually understand the equations." "But," Jaren prompted, "but I won't tell them how it feels to use the witness. I won't describe what it's like to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, to see every possible future and past converging on a single point of absolute certainty. I won't explain the psychological conditioning required to wield that kind of power without going insane. Those are secrets humanity keeps for itself." The shuttle lifted off, climbing through Vorlax 3's atmosphere toward the waiting Council fleet. Sarah watched the planet recede below, thinking about the Talvarians who had spent years building something they thought would make them powerful, only to have it unmade by a weapon they couldn't understand. She felt sympathy for them. They had reached for power the way every ambitious civilization did, the way humanity had during its darkest periods. They had built something terrible and convinced themselves it was necessary, justified, a tool rather than a threat. They had been wrong, but their wrongness was understandable. It was the mistake of people who believed they could control forces beyond their comprehension. The Council debriefing took place aboard the fleet flagship, in a secure chamber designed to contain information that could destabilize governments if leaked. Sarah sat across from a panel of military officials, intelligence analysts, and scientific experts, all trying to understand what she had done and how she had done it. "Explain again how the witness destroyed the Prophet," General Corthan requested, his sixth hand manipulating a holographic display that showed sensor readings from the event. "Our instruments detected nothing that resembles a weapon discharge. No energy signature, no projectile, no electromagnetic pulse. The Prophet simply ceased to exist." "That's because you're looking for conventional weapon effects," Sarah explained patiently. She had already gone through this twice, but the Council officials couldn't seem to grasp the fundamental principles. The witness doesn't destroy targets through energy or force. It destroys them through certainty. It declares a future where the target no longer exists, and reality conforms to that declaration. "But that's not how physics works," protested Dr. Venn, who had joined the debriefing to provide scientific analysis. "You can't simply declare a future and have it manifest. Causality doesn't work that way." Sarah pulled out her notebook and opened it to a page filled with equations that looked more like poetry than mathematics. "Causality works exactly that way, actually. You're just thinking about it in limited terms. Every event that occurs in the present is the result of probabilities collapsing from the quantum foam of potential futures. Most of the time, those collapses happen naturally, following the paths of least resistance. But with sufficient understanding of the underlying mathematics, you can force a specific collapse. You can tell reality which probability you want to manifest, and if you do it right, reality has no choice but to comply. She traced one of the equations with her finger. This is the core principle of the witness. It's not a weapon in the conventional sense. It's a causality engine that allows the user to select specific futures from the probability space and make them inevitable. When I targeted the prophet, I didn't shoot it. I selected every timeline where the prophet was destroyed and collapsed all other possibilities. The weapon didn't cease to exist in our present. It ceased to exist across all possible presents. The room was silent as the officials tried to process this. Several looked like they were developing headaches from the attempt. If this weapon is so powerful, Ambassador Threll said slowly, why doesn't humanity use it to dominate the galaxy? With the ability to enforce any future you desire, you could be unstoppable. Because using the witness makes you remember why power should terrify you, Sarah said quietly. Every time I use it, I see the threads of causality connecting everything to everything else. I see how one death leads to millions of lives saved, how one survival leads to civilizations destroyed. I see the weight of consequences stretching across generations. And I understand, in a way that's impossible to explain, that the power to choose between those futures is a burden no one should want to carry. She closed her notebook. Humanity uses the witness only when absolutely necessary, because we know what happens to civilizations that start believing they have the right to dictate fate. We've seen species destroy themselves with that kind of arrogance. We've been that arrogant ourselves. The witness exists as a reminder of what we're capable of and what we should never do again. Yet you used it today, General Corthan pointed out. To prevent something worse, Sarah countered. The prophet would have created a causality cascade that could have damaged space-time in ways that take centuries to repair. Using the witness to prevent that was justified because the alternative was allowing reality itself to fracture. But don't mistake my willingness to act for enthusiasm. Every time I use this weapon, a piece of me dies. I see too much, know too much, carry too much responsibility. It's like aging 100 years in a few minutes. She stood up from the table. Is there anything else you need from me? Because if not, I'd like to return to Earth and put the witness back where it belongs. In a vault, sealed away, guarded by people who pray they never have to open it again. Ambassador Threll exchanged glances with the other officials. One more question, if you'll indulge us. Are there other weapons like the witness? Does humanity have an arsenal of causality-manipulating devices? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, debating how much truth to share. Finally, she nodded. Yes, the witness is one of 17 weapons that humanity created during our worst conflicts and then sealed away. Each one operates on principles that most civilizations consider impossible. Each one is guarded by people like me, individuals trained from childhood to understand what these weapons do and why they should never be used. 17, Dr. Venn whispered. 17 weapons that can manipulate causality. Not all of them manipulate causality, Sarah corrected. Some work with probability, some with quantum certainty, some with temporal mechanics. But all of them are dangerous in ways that conventional weapons can't match. The witness is probably the most straightforward one. Actually, at least it just kills targets. Some of the others are far more insidious. Like what? General Corthan asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Like the weapon that makes everyone forget you existed. Or the one that ensures you never existed in the first place. Or my personal favorite nightmare. The weapon that forces you to experience every death you've ever caused from the perspective of your victims. Humanity got very creative when we decided to make our species' survival dependent on out-terrifying our enemies. The officials looked horrified, exactly as Sarah intended. Fear was good. Fear meant they would think twice before trying to replicate human weapons technology. Fear meant they might avoid the mistakes that led humanity to create such terrible things in the first place. I think we're done here, Ambassador Threll said, his voice shaking slightly. Thank you for your service, Sarah Chun. The Council is in your debt. No, Sarah said firmly. You're not in my debt. You're in luck. Luck that I was available. Luck that the witness worked as intended. Luck that we stopped the cascade before it started. But don't confuse luck with death. I didn't do this for you. I did it because preventing cosmic-scale disasters is literally my job description. She left the debriefing chamber and returned to her ship, where the witness waited in its secured container. As her vessel broke orbit and set course for Earth, Sarah sat in the pilot's chair and allowed herself a moment of exhaustion. Her hands were shaking. Her perception was still fragmented, showing her probability threads that shouldn't be visible. She could see the futures of everyone on the council station, all the possible paths their lives might take, all branching and diverging like rivers flowing to different seas. She closed her eyes and began the mental exercises that would help her return to normal perception. Breathing patterns that ancestors had developed thousands of years ago, meditation techniques that allowed consciousness to exist in only one timeline at a time, psychological anchors that reminded her which version of reality was actually real. It took 3 hours before she felt stable enough to engage the faster-than-light drive. By the time Earth appeared on her sensors, 2 weeks later, she had almost fully recovered. The probability threads had faded. Her perception was mostly normal. She could look at people again without seeing the ghostly images of their possible futures. Almost normal. Almost recovered. Almost the same person she had been before using the witness. But not quite. Using that weapon always changed you. Always left scars that no one else could see. Sarah knew she would carry this experience with her for the rest of her life, along with all the other times she had been forced to use humanity's impossible weapons to prevent impossible disasters. She landed at the secure facility where humanity stored its most dangerous creations. Armed guards, layers of security, vaults that could survive planetary extinction events. The people who worked here were all like her, guardians who understood what they protected and why it must be protected. The vault door opened with a series of biometric scans and passcode verifications. Sarah carried the witness inside and placed it carefully on its designated platform, next to the empty space where the prophet had briefly existed before being unmade. "Welcome home," she whispered to the weapon. "Sleep well. With any luck, I'll never need you again." But she knew that was probably a lie, because the galaxy was full of people who reached for power without understanding its cost. And humanity, despite its best efforts, would always be the species that understood terrible weapons better than anyone else. That was humanity's burden and its purpose, to create nightmares and then spend eternity making sure those nightmares stayed locked away, used only when the alternative was worse than the horror itself. 3 years passed before Sarah-chan heard about the witness again. 3 years of relative peace, during which she taught classes at the Academy for Advanced Weapons Theory, trained the next generation of weapon guardians, and tried to live something resembling a normal life. She dated occasionally, maintained friendships, even adopted a cat who seemed completely unimpressed by her ability to manipulate causality. Then, Ambassador Threll sent an encrypted message marked with the highest priority codes. The message contained only 7 words. "We need to talk about the witness." Sarah arrived at the council station 3 weeks later, her stomach tight with anxiety. Nothing good ever followed those 7 words. She found Threll waiting for her in the same secure briefing room where they had discussed the Prophet crisis years earlier. But this time he wasn't alone. Dr. Venn was there along with General Corthin and 3 individuals Sarah had never met before. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Threll began. "I want you to meet representatives from the Humanitarian Coalition, a joint organization formed after the Prophet incident to study and regulate weapons that manipulate fundamental forces." The 3 strangers introduced themselves. Ambassador Carrick from the Dravonian Diplomatic Corps, Professor Telmar from the Vraxian Institute of Applied Physics, and Commander Zale from the Coalition's Military Oversight Division. All 3 looked uncomfortable, which immediately put Sarah on edge. "What happened?" Sarah asked, cutting through the formal pleasantries. "Why am I here?" "Because we need your help understanding something impossible," Professor Telmar said, activating a holographic display. The image showed a distant star system, one Sarah didn't recognize. 4 days ago, this entire system experienced what we can only describe as a causality inversion. 8 billion inhabitants across 3 planets and 17 orbital stations all simultaneously ceased to exist. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Ceased to exist or died? We don't know, Telmar admitted. There are no bodies, no wreckage, no evidence that the civilization was ever there. But we have records, transmissions, sensor data confirming that the system was inhabited until 4 days ago. Then, in a single moment, everything and everyone just stopped being. That's not how the witness works, Sarah said immediately. The witness can target individuals or objects, but it can't erase an entire civilization. The causality enforcement has limits. We know, Threll said. That's why we're concerned. This wasn't the witness. This was something else. Something that may have been inspired by your weapon, but operates on completely different principles. Commander Zale brought up additional images, scans of the empty planets, readings that showed impossible gaps in the historical record. We're calling it the eraser. It doesn't kill targets. It retroactively removes them from existence. Not just their present selves, but their entire timeline. As if they were never born, never lived, never affected anything. Sarah sat down heavily, her mind racing through implications. That's orders of magnitude more dangerous than the witness. You're talking about a weapon that can rewrite history itself, that can eliminate people from the causal stream. The paradoxes alone would be catastrophic, which is why we need your expertise, Ambassador Carrix said gently. You're the only person in known space who has successfully used a causality weapon. We need to understand how the eraser works so we can find a way to stop it. Or find out who built it, General Corthin added darkly. Sarah looked at the images of the empty planets, thinking about 8 billion people who had simply stopped existing. Not killed, not destroyed, but unmade. As if their entire lives had been nothing more than a brief error in reality's programming, now corrected. Show me everything you have, she said. Every scan, every reading, every piece of data. If someone built a weapon based on human causality principles, there will be signatures I can recognize. Mathematics humanity developed, and then try to forget. For 3 days, Sarah studied the data from the destroyed system. She barely slept, barely ate, consumed by the puzzle of how someone had created a weapon even more terrible than the witness. The coalition staff brought her meals she didn't taste, and coffee she barely noticed drinking. All her focus was on the numbers, the patterns, the faint traces left behind when reality was forcibly rewritten. On the 3rd day, she found it. There, she said, pointing to a series of quantum fluctuations that the coalition scientists had dismissed as sensor noise. Those aren't random. That's a signature pattern. Someone used an information cascade to trigger a retroactive timeline collapse. They didn't just kill those people. They convinced reality that those people were probabilistically impossible. Dr. Venz studied the readings, her cranial tendrils twitching with confusion. How is that different from what the witness does? The witness enforces a specific future, Sarah explained. It says this target will die and makes that future inevitable. But the eraser works backward. It says this target was never born and forces reality to reconcile that statement with the existing timeline. Reality can't handle the paradox, so it does the only thing it can. It edits the past to make the statement true. But that would create massive causality violations, Professor Telmar protested. Every interaction those people had with others, every decision they influenced, every child they bore, all of that would need to be retroactively changed. The computational requirements alone would be impossible. Impossible for you, Sarah said quietly. But humanity solved those equations during the Unification Wars. We called it the problem of persistent effects. How do you erase someone from history without erasing everything they touched? The answer is you don't. You let reality do the work. You create a causality cascade that propagates backward through time, and reality automatically adjusts all the affected timelines to maintain consistency. She pulled out her notebook and began writing equations that made the coalition scientists' eyes glaze over. It's elegant in a horrifying way. You don't need to calculate every single change. You just need to initiate the cascade and let the universe's natural tendency toward consistency handle the details. Reality wants to make sense. Give it a premise. These people never existed, and it will work backward to create a timeline where that premise is true. But who would build such a weapon? Ambassador Carrick's asked. Who has access to human causality mathematics? Sarah looked up from her notebook, and everyone in the room flinched at her expression. Someone who studied the data from the Prophet incident. Someone who saw the equations I shared with the council during my debriefing. Someone who understood just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be wise. General Corthan's scales rippled with realization. The Talvarians. Some of them survived the facility raid. Most were arrested, but a handful escaped. And they would have access to all the research data from the Prophet Project, Commander Zale added, including whatever theoretical work they derived from studying the witness scans. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a familiar exhaustion settling over her. I told you. I warned all of you. Humanity sealed these weapons away for a reason. We learned these lessons in blood and ash. But you wanted to understand, wanted to analyze, wanted to reduce our nightmares to numbers on your sensors. And now someone has taken those numbers and built something even worse. We need to find them, Threll said firmly. We need to stop them before they use the eraser again. It's too late for that, Sarah said, opening her eyes. Look at the timeline. The system was erased 4 days ago, but we only detected it today. That's not a detection lag. That's reality adjusting. The eraser was used 4 days ago in our current timeline, but reality needed 4 days to propagate all the changes backward through history, which means the weapon is already priming for its next use. She manipulated the holographic display, showing probability calculations that made no sense to anyone else in the room. Based on the cascade patterns, I estimate they'll fire again within 36 hours. And this time, the target will be even larger. They're learning to handle bigger causality edits. Can the witness stop it? Threll asked desperately. Can you enforce a future where the eraser doesn't fire? Sarah shook her head. The witness enforces forward causality. The eraser manipulates backward causality. They're operating on different temporal vectors. It would be like trying to stop a river by pushing upstream. The math doesn't work. Then what do we do? Ambassador Carrick's asked. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars that filled the space beyond the station. Somewhere out there, a handful of Talvarian researchers were preparing to unmake billions more people, convinced that their weapon represented the pinnacle of military achievement. They had no idea what they were actually doing. They thought they were building a tool, but they had created a cancer that could consume reality itself. There's one option, Sarah said quietly, but you're not going to like it. She turned back to face the room. I can use the witness to target the eraser itself, not to destroy it, but to establish a causality anchor. I enforce a future where the eraser fails, where its next activation results in the weapon destroying itself rather than its target. The witness can't stop the eraser directly, but it can manipulate the conditions around the eraser's activation. That sounds risky, Dr. Venn said. What if the interaction between two causality weapons creates even worse paradoxes? It will, Sarah admitted. Absolutely it will. When the witness and the eraser interact, there's going to be a localized causality storm. Space-time in the affected area will become temporarily unstable. Anyone within a few light years might experience temporal echoes, déjà vu, memories of events that never happened or didn't happen yet. But the alternative is allowing the eraser to continue operating, General Corthan said. How many more civilizations will it erase before we find another solution? However, many its creators want, Sarah said, and based on the scale of their second target compared to their first, they're becoming more ambitious. They started with a single system. Next time, it might be a whole sector. Eventually, They'll try to erase something so large that reality can't handle the adjustment, and the entire local cluster will collapse into temporal chaos. Ambassador Threll looked around the room at his colleagues, reading the grim acceptance in their expressions. "How long do you need to prepare?" "I don't," Sarah said. "The witness is aboard my ship. I've been carrying it since I received your message. I had a feeling I might need it." She headed toward the door, then paused. "I went on record that I advised against studying the witness. I warned you that understanding these weapons without understanding why humanity fears them would lead to disaster. I told you our nightmares should remain buried. And I was right. But I don't take any satisfaction in that. Because now I have to fix your mistake by using the very weapon I tried to keep secret." "Sarah," Dr. Venn called out as she reached the door. "What happens to you if the causality storm is worse than you expect? What if the interaction between the witness and the eraser creates a feedback loop you can't escape?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Then I become another cautionary tale. Another name added to the list of people who died using weapons they understood too well. But at least the eraser will be stopped. That's worth the risk." She left the room and returned to her ship. The witness waited in its secure container, seeming almost eager to be used again. Sarah had always anthropomorphized the weapon slightly, imagining it had a personality, a purpose beyond its function. Maybe that was her way of coping with the responsibility of carrying something so terrible. If the weapon wanted to be used, then she was just facilitating its desire rather than making the choice herself. But she knew that was a lie. The witness was a tool. A terrible, powerful tool, but ultimately just an expression of human mathematical genius twisted into a form that could alter fate. She was the one choosing to use it. She was the one accepting the consequences. Sarah opened the container and lifted the witness. It felt heavier than she remembered, as if 3 years of disuse had given it additional weight. Or perhaps she was just more aware of what she was carrying now, more conscious of the burden. "One more time," she whispered to the weapon. "One more crisis to prevent. Then maybe we can both retire for real." The witness pulsed with shifting colors, and Sarah felt her perception begin to expand. She could see the probability threads again, the infinite branching paths of potential futures. She could see the eraser's location, hidden in a forgotten asteroid field where the Talvarian researchers thought they were safe from detection. She could see the moment, 34 hours from now, when they would activate the eraser and attempt to erase the Vraxian homeworld. 5 trillion inhabitants, thousands of years of history, an entire civilization's contribution to galactic culture. All of it would be retroactively unmade if Sarah didn't intervene. But she could also see the causality storm that would result from her intervention. The temporal echoes that would spread across dozens of systems, causing confusion, fear, and minor paradoxes that would take years to fully resolve. She could see herself at the center of that storm, experiencing every possible timeline simultaneously, her consciousness scattered across probability space like light through a prism. She might survive. She might not. The witness showed her both futures with equal clarity, refusing to favor either outcome. The weapon didn't care about her survival. It only cared about enforcing certainty. "Of course you don't care," Sarah muttered. "You're a philosophical concept given physical form. You don't have opinions about who lives or dies. You just make sure that what should be inevitable actually is." She plotted a course to the asteroid field, her hands steady on the controls despite the fear gnawing at her gut. This was different from confronting the prophet. Back then, she had been confident in her understanding of how causality weapons interacted. But the eraser was built by people who had studied the witness without truly comprehending it. They had made intuitive leaps that might be brilliant or catastrophically wrong. Sarah was about to find out which. The journey took 28 hours, putting her at the target location 6 hours before the Talvarians planned to activate the eraser. Sarah used those 6 hours to meditate, to center herself, to prepare mentally for what she was about to do. She had performed this ritual before every witness activation, a series of psychological exercises designed to keep her consciousness coherent while experiencing multiple timelines. But she had never tried to use the witness to counter another causality weapon. The mathematics suggested it would work, but mathematics and reality sometimes disagreed when you were operating at the edges of what physics allowed. At the 5-hour mark, Sarah positioned her ship at the edge of the asteroid field, close enough to target the eraser, but far enough to avoid being caught in the initial paradox wave. She could sense the Talvarian research station hidden among the asteroids, a converted mining facility that shielded their work from casual sensors. At the 4-hour mark, she felt the eraser begin its activation sequence. The weapon was powering up, running final calculations, preparing to edit 5 trillion people out of existence. Sarah felt sick thinking about it, about the casual cruelty of people who thought they were just conducting military research. At the 3-hour mark, she picked up the witness and walked to her ship's observation deck. She needed to see the target directly, needed line of sight, even though the witness didn't require such mundane considerations. It was psychological, human, a need to witness what she was about to do. At the 2-hour mark, she raised the witness and began the targeting sequence. The weapon showed her all possible futures of the eraser, all the potential outcomes of its activation. She saw timelines where the Vraxian homeworld simply stopped existing. She saw the cascade propagating backward, erasing the Vraxians from history, forcing reality to create a universe where they had never evolved. But she also saw the timeline she needed, the one where the eraser's activation resulted in catastrophic feedback, where the weapon turned its own erasure effect on itself, where it unmade its own existence and destroyed the research station in the process. That timeline had a probability of approximately 8%, terrible odds by any normal standard. But the witness didn't care about normal odds. It cared about certainty. At the 1-hour mark, Sarah spoke the words that would enforce fate. The eraser destroys itself. The research station is eliminated. The researchers are killed. This future is inevitable across all timelines. The witness pulsed, accepting her command. Reality bent around her declaration. Space-time itself acknowledging the certainty she had created. Sarah felt her consciousness begin to fracture, spreading across multiple timelines as the witness used her as a focal point for its causality enforcement. She saw herself succeed. She saw herself fail. She saw herself die in the causality storm. She saw herself survive, but lose her sanity from the experience. She saw the eraser activate and destroy the Vraxian homeworld despite her intervention. She saw the Talvarians discover her and activate the eraser against her personally, erasing Sarah Chun from history and leaving humanity without their weapon guardian. All of these futures existed simultaneously, overlapping, contradicting, competing for dominance in the probability space. The witness was forcing them to collapse into a single outcome, but the process took time measured in perceptions rather than seconds, consciousness rather than chronology. And then, at the moment the Talvarians activated the eraser, reality screamed. The causality storm erupted exactly as Sarah had predicted, a wave of temporal distortion that spread across the local sector. Every sapient being within 5 light years suddenly experienced memories of events that never happened, futures that never came to pass, pasts that were never real. The confusion was immediate and overwhelming. Governments scrambled to understand why their populations were reporting collective false memories. Scientists checked their instruments to confirm reality was still functioning properly. Philosophers had existential crises about the nature of consciousness and memory. At the Storm Center, Sarah Chun experienced all timelines simultaneously. She was alive and dead, successful and failed, sane and mad, present and erased. Every possible version of herself existed in superposition, consciousness scattered across probability space like fragments of a shattered mirror. But through the chaos, through the impossible multiplicity of her existence, one truth remained constant. The eraser had destroyed itself. The weapon had activated and immediately experienced cascading failures as the witness forced it to target its own timeline. The research station had vanished in a pulse of antimatter, not destroyed, so much as convinced it had never existed. The Talvarian researchers had ceased to be, their ambitious project ending in the ultimate irony, erased by the very weapon they had built to erase others. The causality storm lasted 17 minutes in objective time, but Sarah experienced it as 17 years. Every second stretched into months, every moment containing entire lifetimes of perception. She felt her consciousness being pulled apart and reassembled countless times, reality testing her coherence by forcing her to exist in mutually contradictory states. But Sarah had trained for this. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for the possibility that using the witness would shatter her across timelines. She had mental anchors, psychological techniques, meditation practices that allowed her to maintain identity even when identity itself became questionable. She held onto the core of who she was, Sarah Chun, weapon guardian, carrier of humanity's nightmares, and refused to let the storm erase that fundamental truth. When the storm finally collapsed, when probability space settled back into a single stable timeline, Sarah found herself on the floor of her ship's observation deck. The witness lay beside her, inert and cool. Her body ached from 17 minutes of muscle tension. Her mind felt like it had been put through a blender and reassembled slightly wrong. But she was alive. She was sane. She was Sarah Chun, and the eraser was gone. She stood slowly, checking her ship's sensors to confirm the results. The research station had vanished completely. Scans showed no wreckage, no debris field, nothing to indicate it had ever been there. The Talvarian researchers had been erased from history by their own weapon, a fitting end to their ambitious project. Sarah sent a status report to the Coalition. Mission successful, eraser destroyed, causality storm contained to acceptable parameters. She didn't mention how close she had come to being lost in the probability space, how many versions of herself had died or gone mad while she struggled to maintain coherence. That was her burden to carry, not theirs to know. The Coalition's response came within hours. Return to the Council Station for debriefing. They had questions about the storm, about the witness, about how Sarah had survived using a weapon that should have killed her. But Sarah didn't return to the station. Instead, she set course for Earth, for the secure facility where humanity kept its nightmares locked away. She had used the witness twice now, and both times she had nearly lost herself in the process. There wouldn't be a third time. She couldn't risk it. The weapon was too powerful, too dangerous, too corrosive to the consciousness that wielded it. When she reached Earth, she carried the witness into its vault personally. She placed it on its platform, next to the empty spaces where other weapons waited to never be used. And she sealed the vault with codes that only 3 people on Earth possessed. "I'm done," she told the weapon. "I've carried you for 10 years, used you twice, and both times it nearly destroyed me. Someone else can be the guardian now. Someone younger, stronger, less aware of how much it costs to enforce fate." But as she turned to leave, she felt the weight of knowledge settling over her. There was no one else. No one else had trained as long as she had, understood as deeply as she did, survived as she had survived. She was humanity's weapon guardian not because she wanted to be, but because she was the only one who could be. She would carry this burden for the rest of her life. And when she was too old or too damaged to continue, she would train someone to replace her. And that person would train their replacement. An unbroken line of guardians, each one carrying humanity's darkest secrets, each one standing between civilization and the weapons we had created in our worst moments. Outside the vault, the sun was setting over the facility. Sarah walked out into the evening air and breathed deeply, grounding herself in the simple reality of wind and warmth and the smell of Earth's atmosphere. She was home. She was alive. She was sane. For now, that was enough. The stars would still be there tomorrow, full of dangers that might require impossible weapons and impossible choices. But tomorrow was a problem for tomorrow's Sarah. Tonight, she was just a woman who had survived something that should have killed her, standing beneath her species' sky, grateful for the simple fact of existence. And in the vault behind her, the witness waited patiently, certain that someday, inevitably, it would be needed again. Because that was the nature of terrible weapons. They were never truly finished. They just slept between nightmares, dreaming of the certainty they could enforce, the fates they could seal, the futures they could make inevitable. And humanity, despite all its progress and civilization and dreams of peace, would always need someone brave enough or foolish enough to carry those weapons when the nightmares returned. Sarah Chun was that someone. And she would continue to be for as long as the galaxy needed humanity's guardians to stand between civilization and the darkness it had once embraced. That was her fate. And unlike the targets of the witness, she had chosen it freely, with full knowledge of what it would cost. That made all the difference. Ignorance, in this case, was the greatest gift Sarah Chun could give them.